I was around 9 years old when we moved into the old house on the edge of town. It wasn't a particularly big house, but it had that classic Victorian look. Steep roof, narrow windows, and an attic with a single round window that stared out like an unblinking eye. The place had been sitting empty for years, and I remember my parents talking about what a great deal they got on it. They were excited for a fresh start, but even as a kid, I could tell that something felt off. It started with the window. There was a small square window at the end of the upstairs hallway, right across from my bedroom. It faced the overgrown backyard where the old swing set creaked in the wind. One night, about a week after we moved in, I woke up feeling strange. My room was completely silent, but something made me turn my head toward the open door. Through the darkness, I could see the window at the end of the hall, and someone was standing in front of it. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but my bedroom light was off. There was no way I could see myself that clearly. The figure stood completely still, its head tilted slightly. It was a boy, about my age, but I couldn't make out his face. I sat up, staring. The moment I moved, he stepped away from the window and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. I was too scared to get up. Instead, I pulled the blankets over my head and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that it was a trick of the moonlight or my sleepy brain playing tricks on me. But then things got worse. Every night, I'd wake up at the same exact time, 2:34 a.m., and every time I'd look toward the hallway, and he would be there, standing in front of the window, watching me. I told my mom about the boy. She gave me the usual, "It's just a dream" response, telling me it was because I was adjusting to the new house. My dad joked that maybe I had a guardian angel watching over me, but I didn't feel protected. I felt hunted. One night, after waking up to find him in the hallway again, I worked up the courage to whisper, "Who are you?" For the first time, he moved. He lifted his hand, slowly, mechanically, and pointed at me. I couldn't breathe. I pulled the blankets over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. That was the first night I heard the tapping, software rhythmic, coming from inside the walls. A few days later, I was in the backyard playing alone when I noticed something sticking out of the dirt near the old swing set. It was small and metallic, reflecting the sunlight. I knelt down and pulled it out. It was a bracelet, rusted and covered in dirt, a child's bracelet, and it had a name engraved on it. Caleb. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at my bedroom door, dreading the moment 2:34 a.m. would arrive. When it did, I turned my head slowly. The boy was there. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a tall, thin figure, barely visible in the dim light. Its head was unnaturally long, its arms hanging at its sides, and unlike Caleb, it had a face, a twisted, grinning face. Then Caleb did something he had never done before. He turned his head toward the figure beside him. Then, without warning, they both started running towards me. I screamed. The moment I did, my bedroom light flickered on. My mom burst in, panic on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked. I was shaking, pointing toward the hallway. But it was empty, just the dark window at the end of the hall. After that night, things spiraled. I started waking up to scratches on my arms. My parents assumed I was doing it to myself in my sleep, but I knew better. The walls would tap, even when I was wide awake. And then I started hearing whispers through the air vents. One night, I pressed my ear against the vent, straining to hear. And what I heard was a voice. Small, hoarse. "Help me." That was enough for me. I begged my parents to let me sleep in their room, but they wouldn't budge. So I decided to find answers myself. The next day, I asked our neighbor, an old woman named Mrs. Taylor, if she knew anything about the house. She hesitated, then sighed. "Many years ago," she said, "a little boy lived here. He went missing. They never found him. My stomach dropped. What was his name? I asked, but I already knew the answer. Caleb. That night, I made a decision. At 2:34 a.m. when I woke up, I didn't look away. I sat up, and for the first time, I spoke directly to him. Caleb, do you need help? He didn't move at first, but then he lifted his hand again, but this time he pointed at the wall. The tapping started immediately, faster than before. Something inside the wall was moving. That was the moment my dad came into my room, angry that I was still awake. But when he saw my face, pale, drenched in sweat, he stopped. "What's wrong?" he asked. I pointed at the wall. "Something's in there." The next morning, my dad reluctantly cut into the drywall. At first, there was nothing but dust and insulation. But then, as he dug further, his face went pale. Inside the wall, they found bones. The police investigation lasted weeks. The remains were confirmed to be Caleb's. He had been missing for over 30 years. There was no explanation for how he ended up there, or who put him there. But deep down, I knew. The tall, grinning figure that stood beside Caleb that night, that was the thing that took him. And it almost took me too. We moved out not long after. But sometimes, even now when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel it. The weight of someone watching me. And I still wake up at 2:34 a.m. When I was 10 years old, my family moved into an old rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything special, just a small 2-story home with peeling wallpaper and creaky wooden floors. But it was cheap, and my parents were excited about a fresh start. I wasn't. From the moment we stepped inside, I felt watched. It wasn't like a normal new house feeling. It was something else, something wrong. At night, the house was never silent. There was always something, a soft scratching in the walls, a distant thud in the attic, or the feeling of a shadow moving just beyond my line of sight. I told my mom about the sounds, but she brushed it off. "It's just an old house settling," she'd say. But I knew better. The first time I saw him, I was in bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy. The room was too quiet, like the house was holding its breath. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate tapping coming from the air vent near my bed. I turned my head, expecting to see a mouse or something, but instead I saw an eye staring back at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't animal-sized, it was human. The eye blinked. I screamed. My parents rushed in, turning on the lights, but by the time they checked, the vent was empty. Just dust and darkness. After that, the noises got worse. At night, I'd hear heavy breathing coming from the vents, footsteps in the attic, and sometimes whispers, just on the edge of hearing, like someone muttering to themselves, waiting for me to fall asleep. My dad still insisted it was just the house settling. But one night, my mom finally admitted she had been hearing things too. "We should check the attic," she told my dad. But he refused. "I'm not paying for some damn exterminator when it's just pipes and bad insulation," he muttered. He should have listened, because things only got worse. One night I was home alone while my parents went out for dinner. I was sitting in the living room watching TV, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach. Then, the volume cut out. The screen flickered to static. At the same time, from the vent above the couch, I heard a voice. "I see you." I ran upstairs, slamming my bedroom door shut. I crawled into bed, heart racing, trying to convince myself that I imagined it. But then, the closet door creaked open. I sat up slowly, staring into the dark gap, and I saw him. A thin, pale figure crouched in the closet, his body twisted unnaturally to fit between the shelves. His eyes were wide, too wide, and his mouth stretched into a thin, unnatural grin. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in a slow, croaking voice, he whispered, "You let me in," I screamed. When my parents came home, I was hysterical, pointing at the closet. But when they opened it, it was empty. Still, my mom finally convinced my dad to check the attic. The next day, he climbed up with a flashlight. After a few minutes, I heard him gasp. Then he ran downstairs, pale as a ghost. "We're leaving," he said. He wouldn't tell us what he saw, just that we had to go. It wasn't until years later that I finally learned the truth. My mom told me that when my dad checked the attic, he found a small crawl space leading into the walls. Inside, there was a nest of old blankets, empty food wrappers, and rotting clothes. And scrawled across the wooden beams in black marker was a message: "I've been watching you." We never went back to that house, but sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. That slow, deliberate tapping in the vents. And I wonder, did we really escape? Or did he just find a new way in? When I was 11 years old, my family moved into my grandmother's old farmhouse after she passed away. It was a lonely, isolated place, surrounded by fields and thick woods that stretched for miles. The house was old, creaky wooden floors, dusty furniture, and faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. But the thing I remember most was the well. It sat at the edge of our backyard, made of crumbling stone, covered in thick moss and tangled vines. The opening was covered by a rusty iron grate, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I was told never to go near it. My dad warned me that the grate wasn't stable and that I could fall in. My mom just said it gave her a bad feeling. But I was a curious kid, and like most kids, the more you tell them not to do something, the more they want to. So one afternoon, when my parents were inside unpacking boxes, I wandered over to it. The air around the well felt different, colder. I gripped the edge of the stones and peeked through the grate. All I could see was darkness, an endless gaping pit stretching down into the unknown. I was about to turn away when I heard it, a faint voice. "Hello." My breath caught in my throat. It was a child's voice, soft, almost whimpering. I hesitated, then whispered back, "Hello? Who's there?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it replied, "I'm stuck. Please help me." I jumped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My mind was racing. Was there actually someone down there? I ran inside to tell my parents. But when I explained what I heard, my mom's face went pale. My dad didn't say anything at first. He just exchanged a look with my mom before shaking his head. "There's no one down there," he said firmly. "You stay away from that well." And that was the end of it. Except, it wasn't. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my window. A faint, scraping noise, like fingernails against glass. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering. And then, the whisper came again. "Help me." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the air vent in my room. I bolted out of bed, ran down the hall, and shook my parents awake. Through panicked gasps, I told them what I heard. My dad got up immediately, grabbing a flashlight. He checked the vent. Nothing. Then he checked outside my window. Nothing. Finally, with an unreadable expression, he grabbed his coat and marched out to the well. I followed at a distance, watching as he shined the flashlight down through the grate. Silence. Nothing but an endless black pit. After a long moment, he turned to me, his face tense. "You're never to come near this well again." Do you understand me?" I nodded, too scared to argue. For a while, everything was quiet, until a week later. It was past midnight when I woke up to something off. At first, I couldn't place it. Then I realized the air felt wrong, like something had changed. That's when I noticed it. The window. It was open. A soft breeze pushed through my curtains, carrying with it a faint, rotting smell. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked my window before going to bed. I slowly turned my head toward the foot of my bed. And that's when I saw it. A thin, soaking wet figure hunched over, its limbs too long and twisted. Its pale face dripped with murky water, and its mouth was too wide, stretching into an unnatural grin. Then, in a voice that no longer sounded like a child, it whispered, "I got out." I don't remember screaming. I don't remember my parents bursting into my room, turning on the lights. All I remember is that by the time they got there, it was gone. Just a puddle of black water on my bedroom floor. The next morning, my dad didn't say a word. He just grabbed a shovel and concrete mix and sealed the well shut. We moved out of that house the following summer, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear it, a faint, distant whisper. I got out, and I wonder, where is it now?